At dinner, my daughter-in-law slapped me, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and her parents? They clapped. I smiled, stayed calm, and what I did next changed everything. Watch till the end to see how years of betrayal turned into the sweetest revenge. Margaret Collins stood alone in the kitchen, carefully adjusting the plates on the dining table as if perfection could somehow fix the growing cracks in her life. The soft glow of candlelight flickered across the polished wood surface, reflecting years of memories that once made this house feel warm and alive. She had spent the entire afternoon cooking, preparing Daniel's favorite roasted chicken with herbs, creamy mashed potatoes, and freshly baked bread, hoping that tonight might bring even a small moment of appreciation. The smell of food filled the air, rich and comforting, yet her chest felt heavy with a quiet dread she could not ignore. For 35 years, she had been the foundation of this family, sacrificing her dreams, her time, and her energy to give her son a life filled with love and stability. Every corner of this house carried a piece of her effort, from the curtains she had sewn by hand to the walls she had painted while Daniel was still a child. She remembered the nights she stayed awake when he was sick, the mornings she woke up early to prepare his school lunches, and the countless times she reassured him that he could achieve anything he wanted. Those memories now felt distant, like echoes from a life that no longer belonged to her. She heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of laughter that did not include her. Daniel walked in first, his posture relaxed, his eyes glued to his phone, barely acknowledging her presence as he passed by. Behind him came Ashley, his wife, dressed elegantly and carrying herself with a confidence that often felt more like superiority. Her parents followed closely, Richard and Linda Harper, their expressions already carrying a hint of judgment as they glanced around the room. Margaret forced a gentle smile and greeted them warmly, hoping to create a peaceful atmosphere despite the tension she could already feel building. Ashley barely returned the greeting and instead scanned the table with a critical eye, as if searching for flaws to point out. Richard let out a small chuckle, commenting on how traditional everything looked, while Linda nodded in agreement, her lips forming a thin line of disapproval. Margaret tried to brush it off and invited everyone to sit, her voice calm despite the unease growing inside her. They took their seats, and for a brief moment, there was silence as plates were served and glasses were filled. Margaret sat down slowly, her hands slightly trembling as she placed her napkin on her lap, hoping this dinner would pass without conflict. Ashley took a sip of her wine and leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on Margaret with a smirk that immediately made the older woman feel small. She commented on the meal, questioning the choice of recipe in a tone that carried both mockery and disdain. Margaret explained softly that it was Daniel's favorite dish, hoping that would justify her effort and bring some understanding. Daniel did not look up from his phone, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. Ashley laughed lightly and said that tastes change and that some people fail to grow with time, her words cutting deeper than she likely realized. Richard and Linda joined in the laughter, their amusement making Margaret feel like an outsider in her own home. Margaret tried to remain composed, reminding herself that reacting would only make things worse, yet the weight of years of quiet disrespect pressed heavily on her heart. She spoke again, her voice gentle but firm, saying that she had done her best for the family. Ashley leaned forward, her expression turning cold, and replied that Margaret's best was no longer enough. The word struck like a blow, leaving Margaret momentarily speechless as she struggled to hold back tears. She felt something inside her begin to crack, a mixture of pain, frustration, and disbelief at how far things had deteriorated. She reminded Ashley that she had built this home and raised Daniel with love and sacrifice, her voice trembling as emotions she had suppressed for years finally began to surface. Before she could finish her sentence, Ashley stood abruptly and struck her across the face with a sharp slap that echoed through the room. Margaret froze, her mind struggling to process what had just happened as her cheek burned with both pain and humiliation. She looked at Ashley in shock, searching for some sign of regret, but found none. Ashley's expression remained cold and unapologetic as she warned Margaret not to raise her voice. Margaret had not even realized she had raised it, her emotions simply spilling over after years of silence. Before she could gather herself, a second slap landed, stronger than the first, causing her to stagger slightly. The room seemed to spin as she tried to maintain her balance, her heart pounding in her chest. Then came the third slap, final and deliberate, as if to establish dominance and erase any remaining sense of dignity Margaret still held. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, her breath uneven as she fought to remain standing. What hurt even more than the physical pain was the reaction that followed. Richard and Linda began to clap, their applause slow and deliberate, as if Ashley had accomplished something worthy of praise. Linda smiled proudly at her daughter, complimenting her for putting Margaret in her place, while Richard nodded in approval. Margaret felt a wave of disbelief wash over her, her eyes moving from one face to another in search of humanity, of empathy, of anything that might make sense of the situation. Finally, her gaze settled on Daniel. He sat there, silent and motionless, his phone now resting on the table, yet he made no attempt to defend her or even acknowledge what had just happened. That silence shattered something deep within her, something that could never be repaired. In that moment, she realized that the son she had raised with so much love was no longer the same person sitting before her. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The room felt suffocating, the air heavy with tension and cruelty, yet Margaret stood there, gathering what little strength she had left. She reached for her phone with steady hands, surprising even herself with the calmness of her actions. Ashley rolled her eyes and mocked her, asking what she planned to do, her tone dripping with sarcasm and disbelief. Margaret looked directly at her, her expression no longer filled with fear but with a quiet resolve that had been absent for years. She replied simply that she was going to call someone. The words carried a weight that shifted the atmosphere in the room, even if only slightly. Ashley laughed again, dismissing her as dramatic and powerless, while her parents continued to watch with amusement. Margaret did not respond to their mockery, her focus entirely on the decision she had just made. As she unlocked her phone and scrolled to the number she had not contacted in years, memories of a different life resurfaced, reminding her of the strength she once had and the support she had long forgotten. Her finger hovered over the call button for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of the turning point she was about to create. Then she pressed it, bringing the phone to her ear as the ringing sound filled the quiet space around her. Each second that passed felt like an eternity, yet with every ring, her fear diminished and her determination grew stronger. The people in the room continued their conversations, unaware that the balance of power was about to shift in a way they could never have anticipated. Margaret stood tall despite the pain, her posture reflecting a newfound strength that came from years of endurance finally reaching its limit. She realized that this moment, painful as it was, marked the end of her silence and the beginning of something entirely different. For the first time in a long time, she was no longer acting out of fear or obligation, but out of a deep need to reclaim her dignity. As the call connected and a voice answered on the other end, Margaret took a steady breath, her decision now irreversible. She spoke calmly, her voice clear and unwavering, signaling that the woman they had underestimated was no longer willing to accept the role they had forced upon her. And in that moment, though the pain remained, it was accompanied by something new, something powerful, something that would change everything that followed. Margaret Collins held the phone tightly against her ear as the faint echo of the voice on the other end lingered in her mind, and even after the call ended, her hand did not immediately drop because something inside her needed a moment to accept what she had just done. The room behind her buzzed with low laughter and dismissive whispers, as if the people sitting at her dining table were confident that whatever she had just done carried no real consequence. Ashley leaned back in her chair with an exaggerated sigh, swirling the wine in her glass as though she had just finished watching a dull performance that failed to impress her. Richard muttered something under his breath about unnecessary drama, while Linda smirked with the same quiet arrogance that had defined her presence since the moment she entered the house. Daniel remained silent, though his eyes had shifted slightly toward his mother, not with concern, but with a faint trace of confusion, as if he was finally beginning to realize that something about this situation was not as simple as it appeared. Margaret slowly lowered the phone, her movements calm and deliberate, as though she had stepped into a version of herself that none of them had ever seen before. She walked back toward the table and took her seat without asking for permission or waiting for acknowledgement, her posture straight and composed despite the lingering sting on her cheek. Ashley let out a short laugh and shook her head, clearly unimpressed by the quiet confidence Margaret now carried, and she made a sarcastic remark about how calling someone would not magically change reality. Margaret did not respond, not because she lacked the words, but because she no longer felt the need to defend herself in front of people who had already decided her worth. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and allowed the silence to settle, a silence that felt different this time, heavier and filled with anticipation rather than helplessness. The ticking of the clock on the wall became more noticeable with each passing second, marking the slow progression toward a moment that none of them fully understood yet. Ashley attempted to fill the silence with casual conversation, turning to her parents and making light remarks about work, social events, and trivial matters that had no real significance. Yet her voice carried a slight edge, a subtle indication that she was trying to maintain control of the atmosphere. Richard joined in, laughing a little louder than necessary, while Linda added comments that sounded rehearsed, as if they were all participating in a performance meant to reinforce their superiority. Margaret observed them quietly, her eyes steady and her thoughts clear, recognizing for the first time how much of their behavior relied on her silence and submission. Without those elements, their confidence seemed forced, almost fragile, like a structure built on weak foundations that could collapse at the slightest pressure. Daniel shifted in his seat and glanced at Margaret again, his expression now more uncertain than before, as though he was struggling to reconcile the mother he had always known with the woman sitting across from him now. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, but then closed it again, choosing silence over confrontation, a choice that Margaret noticed and understood more deeply than he could ever imagine. The minutes stretched on, each one adding to the growing tension in the room, until even Ashley's composure began to show small cracks, her fingers tapping lightly against the glass as her eyes occasionally flicked toward the door. Margaret remained still, her breathing steady, her mind focused not on the humiliation she had endured, but on the certainty that something was about to change. She could feel it in the way her heart beat, not with fear, but with a quiet strength that had been buried beneath years of compromise and endurance. For so long, she had accepted her role as the one who absorbed the pain, who kept the peace, who sacrificed her own dignity for the sake of harmony. But now she understood that harmony built on silence was not peace at all, but a slow erosion of self. The sound of cutlery against plates continued for a while, though no one seemed particularly interested in the food anymore, as the focus of the evening had shifted entirely to the unspoken question hanging in the air. Ashley eventually set her glass down with a small clink and looked directly at Margaret, her expression now more curious than mocking, as if she was trying to gauge whether there was something she had underestimated. She asked again who Margaret had called, this time with less sarcasm and more insistence, but Margaret simply met her gaze and replied that she would find out soon enough. That answer did not satisfy Ashley, but it also did not provoke the reaction she had expected, and for a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. Richard attempted to dismiss the situation once more, suggesting that whatever was coming could not possibly matter, yet his tone lacked the confidence it had earlier, revealing a subtle shift in his own perception. Linda remained quiet, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Margaret, perhaps sensing that something about this situation was no longer within their control. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant, asking his mother what was going on, but Margaret did not answer him directly, choosing instead to let the moment unfold naturally rather than explaining something he had not earned the right to understand. The tension continued to build, filling the room with a sense of anticipation that made even the smallest sound seem amplified, from the ticking clock to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. Margaret's thoughts drifted briefly to the past, to the years she had spent believing that endurance was the same as strength, that silence was the same as dignity, and she realized now how wrong she had been. True strength, she understood, was not about everything without breaking, but about knowing when to stop allowing others to define your worth. The realization settled within her like a quiet certainty, reinforcing the calm resolve that now guided her actions. Ashley stood up and began pacing slowly, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythmic pattern that mirrored her growing impatience, and she made another remark about how ridiculous the situation had become, yet her voice carried a slight tremor that betrayed her unease. Richard checked his watch, muttering about wasted time, while Linda crossed her arms and remained silent, her attention fixed entirely on Margaret. Daniel stayed seated, his posture tense, his eyes moving between his mother and the door, as if he was waiting for something he could not yet define. Margaret remained seated, her hands still, her expression composed, embodying a quiet authority that had not been present before. The seconds continued to pass, each one bringing them closer to the moment that would shift everything, and though none of them could see it yet, the balance of power in that room had already begun to change. Then, finally, the sound came, clear and unmistakable, cutting through the tension like a sharp note in a silent room. The knock on the door was firm and deliberate, neither rushed nor hesitant, carrying a sense of purpose that immediately drew everyone's attention. Ashley froze mid-step, her head turning toward the door, her expression shifting from irritation to surprise. Richard straightened in his chair, his earlier confidence replaced by a more cautious demeanor, while Linda's eyes widened slightly as she exchanged a quick glance with her husband. Daniel looked at Margaret, his confusion deepening as he tried to understand what was happening, but Margaret did not look back at him. Instead, she slowly stood up, her movements measured and calm, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. The room fell completely silent, every gaze fixed on her as she began to walk toward the door, each step steady and unhurried. The sound of her footsteps seemed louder than usual, echoing in the quiet space and adding to the weight of the moment. Ashley spoke again, asking who was at the door, but her voice lacked its usual sharpness, replaced instead by a hint of uncertainty that she could not fully conceal. Margaret did not answer, not because she wanted to create suspense, but because the answer was about to reveal itself in a way that words could not capture. She reached the door and paused for a brief moment, her hand resting on the handle, her heart steady and her mind clear. This was the moment where everything shifted, where the silence she had carried for years would finally be broken in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. She turned the handle slowly and opened the door, allowing the cool air from outside to flow into the house, bringing with it a sense of change that was almost tangible. As she looked at the figure standing on the other side, she felt a quiet confirmation that she had made the right choice, that the path she had chosen in that moment of pain had led her to a place of strength. Behind her, the people at the table waited, their earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of unease, as they realized that whatever was about to happen was no longer under their control. Margaret stepped slightly aside, allowing the person at the door to enter, and as she did, she felt the final traces of fear leave her completely, replaced by a calm certainty that she had reclaimed something far more valuable than their approval. In that moment, she was no longer the woman they had dismissed or humiliated, but someone who had chosen to stand up for herself, and that choice carried a power that none of them had anticipated. Margaret Collins opened the door to reveal a tall man in a crisp dark suit, his presence commanding and calm, yet with an air of familiarity that immediately made her heart settle despite the tension in the room. Behind him stood two uniformed officers, their expressions serious and professional, as though they had been called to a situation far more important than any ordinary domestic dispute. Ashley's confident smirk faltered almost instantly, replaced by confusion and a flicker of fear she could not quite hide, while Richard and Linda Harper's casual arrogance evaporated, leaving only unease and suspicion on their faces. Margaret stepped aside to let them in, her movements composed, deliberate, and confident, signaling to everyone present that she was now in control. The officers entered first, taking measured steps across the polished floor, their eyes scanning the room with an attention to detail that made even the Harper family shift slightly in their seats. The man in the suit followed, his gaze meeting Margaret's with recognition and respect, and she could feel the weight of years of quiet support and partnership reflected in that single look. "Good evening, Margaret," he said in a calm, authoritative voice, one that carried both reassurance and strength, immediately silencing the room. "Thank you for coming," Margaret replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the nervous anticipation she had felt while waiting for this moment. Ashley rose from her chair, her voice sharp, demanding to know what was happening, her usual confidence wavering despite her efforts to mask it. The man looked directly at Ashley, his tone calm but firm. "My name is James Carter," he said, his presence commanding absolute attention. "I am Daniel Collins' business partner and co-owner of this house." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with weight, and the room went silent. Daniel finally looked up from his chair, his eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. "James, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with both surprise and a growing sense of dread. James did not answer Daniel directly. Instead, he turned to Margaret and asked gently, "Would you like me to proceed?" Margaret nodded, her movements calm and deliberate, her resolve evident in the steady line of her shoulders. Ashley's voice cracked with incredulity as she demanded, "Proceed with what?" James opened a large folder, its leather cover polished and immaculate, and held it up to show the contents. This property, along with Daniel's company, was legally transferred 2 years ago into a joint trust, he announced, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no contradiction. The Harper family's expressions shifted in real time, from disbelief to confusion, and finally to something akin to panic as the implications of his words settled in their minds. Margaret's heart beat steadily, her focus entirely on the truth she had finally chosen to reveal, a truth that had been buried under years of silent labor, sacrifice, and quiet contribution to Daniel's life and business. "Margaret Collins is the primary beneficiary," James continued, his tone unwavering, letting each word sink in slowly so that everyone could fully comprehend the significance. Ashley gasped, her mouth opening slightly as though to speak but finding herself unable to find the right words. No, that's impossible, she finally stammered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Margaret stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Ashley's, her expression calm but firm. For years, I stayed silent, she said, her voice steady despite the flood of emotions inside her. I endured the disrespect, the insults, and the humiliation. Ashley's lips pressed together tightly, and she shook her head in denial, unable to reconcile the quiet, obedient woman she had always mocked with the strong, composed figure now standing before her. James continued, turning to address the room in general. And there's more, he said, a pause emphasizing the weight of what was about to follow. Ashley's arrogance faltered as the officers shifted slightly, preparing to intervene in a way that had nothing to do with mere social etiquette. I have also been informed of the physical assault that occurred tonight, James said, his voice unwavering, as one of the officers stepped forward, ready to take statements and document the incident officially. Ashley laughed nervously, attempting to diminish the situation, but the laughter fell flat, sounding forced even to her own ears. This is ridiculous, she muttered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the truth. She was beginning to realize the severity of the consequences she now faced. Richard and Linda exchanged glances, their earlier composure replaced with uncertainty, as the gravity of the situation became undeniable. Margaret, standing tall in front of them, continued speaking, her voice quiet but powerful. For years, I raised Daniel, supported his business quietly, and sacrificed my own needs without complaint, she said, her eyes never leaving Ashley's. I accepted insults, sarcasm, and humiliation. I endured being treated like a shadow in my own home. Ashley attempted to interrupt, but Margaret raised her hand slightly, signaling that she would not be stopped. But tonight, Margaret continued, her voice filled with controlled intensity, you crossed a line that cannot be ignored. Ashley's face turned pale, and even Daniel's eyes widened as he began to grasp the full scope of what his mother was revealing. Margaret's gaze softened briefly as she glanced at Daniel, her son, before returning her focus to Ashley. I have endured, I have tolerated, and I have forgiven, she said slowly, emphasizing each word with precision. But I will not be broken again. The room remained tense, the officers standing quietly, observing, ready to act if necessary, while James placed the folder carefully on the table, letting the documents speak for themselves. Margaret reached into the folder and retrieved a set of papers, laying them out so that Ashley and her parents could see them clearly, the legal documents proving the transfer of property and trust in Margaret's favor. Ashley's hands trembled slightly as she reached toward the papers, but she could not look Margaret in the eye. You can't do this, she stammered, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and disbelief. Margaret nodded slowly, her expression calm but resolute. I already have, she said quietly, letting the weight of her words settle over everyone in the room. James stepped forward, addressing the Harper family directly. The assault will also be documented, and statements will be taken. The law will now be involved, and every detail will be scrutinized. Richard sputtered, attempting to regain some semblance of control, but his words faltered under the certainty of the situation. Linda remained silent, her eyes narrowing as she processed that the power dynamics they had relied upon for years had shifted completely. Daniel looked at his mother, his face a mixture of shock, guilt, and confusion, realizing that his own actions, or lack thereof, had allowed this imbalance to persist. Margaret took a deep breath, her chest steady, her voice calm and commanding. For years, I accepted being powerless, but tonight, I reclaim that power, she said, her eyes sweeping across the room. I will no longer allow anyone to treat me as less than I am. Ashley took a step forward desperately, her voice rising slightly. Mom. Daniel, this is insane. You're overreacting. Margaret shook her head slowly, her hands resting lightly on the table as she leaned forward slightly. No, Ashley, she said clearly, each word deliberate. This is long overdue justice. The officers moved slightly closer, their presence a subtle but firm reminder that the law was now on Margaret's side. James nodded to Margaret quietly, a silent acknowledgement that the next steps were fully under her control. She looked at Ashley one final time, her gaze unwavering, filled with a quiet but undeniable authority. You wanted power, she said softly. You wanted control. Tonight, you learned that power is not given, it is earned, and I have earned mine. The room fell into silence, heavy and unyielding, as everyone absorbed the full significance of Margaret's words. Margaret straightened, her shoulders squared, her heart steady, knowing that for the first time in years, she had taken complete control of her own life and destiny. She was no longer the silent observer, the patient caretaker, or the submissive mother-in-law. She was a force that could not be ignored. And in that moment, surrounded by shocked faces and a tense atmosphere, Margaret Collins finally understood that the long-awaited moment of truth had arrived, and with it, the sweetest sense of vindication she had ever experienced. Margaret Collins stepped into the living room, her heart steady and her mind clear, fully aware that the moment she had long anticipated had finally arrived, and that every ounce of patience, endurance, and strength she had accumulated over the years would now be put to use in reclaiming the life and dignity that had been taken from her. And as she looked around the room, she saw the shock on Ashley's face, the confusion in Daniel's eyes, and the disbelief in Richard and Linda Harper's expressions, all of which gave her a quiet satisfaction that the power dynamics had shifted completely in her favor. And though her cheek still burned slightly from the slaps she had endured earlier, the pain now felt distant, almost irrelevant, overshadowed by the surge of resolve and authority that coursed through her veins, and she knew that she would no longer allow anyone to treat her as inferior or unworthy, because tonight marked a turning point not just in this household, but in the life she had long postponed living fully. And as James Carter, Daniel's business partner, stepped forward with the papers that detailed her rightful ownership and control over the house and business, Margaret felt a sense of calm triumph wash over her, knowing that the legal validation of her years of sacrifice was finally in her hands. And she looked at Daniel, her son, who now seemed torn between loyalty to the woman he had married and the realization of his mother's true strength. And she understood that this was his reckoning as well, a moment in which he would have to confront the consequences of his silence, and perhaps even his complicity, in allowing his wife and her parents to undermine her for so long. And Margaret's eyes then met Ashley's, who attempted to maintain composure but could not hide the fear and uncertainty now creeping into her once cocky demeanor. And the sight of Ashley's faltering confidence gave Margaret a quiet satisfaction, because it was the first sign of justice taking its natural course, and she spoke slowly, deliberately, and firmly, ensuring that every word carried the weight of her years of patience and suppressed anger, saying, "For too long, I have been pushed aside, ignored, and humiliated, but tonight, everything changes, and you will learn that respect is not demanded through fear, but earned through integrity and truth. And the moment has come for all of you to understand that I am no longer the woman you underestimated." And as she finished speaking, James Carter nodded silently, acknowledging that everything was in place for Margaret to take full control, while the officers stationed themselves discreetly but attentively, ready to ensure that the law would support her rightful claim should anyone attempt to interfere. And the weight of their presence added another layer of security and authority to the room, making it clear that Margaret's decision was backed not just by her resolve, but by legal and institutional power as well. And the Harpers shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the dinner table, once a stage for mockery and humiliation, had now become a platform for accountability and revelation. And Margaret walked slowly toward the documents, her fingers brushing the folder containing all the legal proofs of her ownership and rights. And as she placed them on the table in front of Ashley and her parents, she could see the disbelief etched into their faces, their previous arrogance now replaced with apprehension and dread. And Daniel picked up the papers, his hands trembling slightly, as he began to understand the scope of the revelations his mother had orchestrated. And Margaret's chest swelled with a quiet pride, knowing that the years of silent contribution, the late nights, the early mornings, the sacrifices she had made to support her son and his endeavors, were now acknowledged and validated in a way that could not be ignored or reversed. And as she spoke again, her voice soft but commanding, she told them, "The house, the company, and the trust are mine to manage, and the time for disrespect is over. And I will no longer allow any person to diminish me or undermine the efforts I have made for this family." And the Harper parents shifted in their seats, their faces pale as they realized that the social power they had wielded so confidently was now irrelevant. And Ashley's hands shook slightly as she reached for the papers but recoiled when Margaret's gaze met hers, signaling that she could not approach without permission. And Margaret allowed a small, controlled smile to grace her lips as she observed the fear and confusion she had so carefully orchestrated, because the satisfaction of seeing someone who had caused so much pain confront the reality of their actions was a rare and fulfilling moment. And then she looked at Daniel, her voice softening, "You must understand, son, that love and loyalty cannot coexist with silence in the face of wrongdoing. And tonight, you witness what happens when an action allows cruelty to flourish, and it is time for you to learn that respect and family are not obligations to be taken lightly, but responsibilities to be honored." And Daniel's eyes filled with tears as he finally comprehended how Much his mother had endured and how little he had done to prevent the humiliation she had suffered, and Margaret's heart, though heavy with the memory of betrayal, was also filled with relief that the truth was now undeniable, and she returned her gaze to Ashley, whose bravado had completely evaporated, leaving her trembling in fear as she whispered, "Mom, what do we do now?" And Margaret's reply was measured, precise, and final. "The consequences of your actions are yours to bear. It is no longer my responsibility to shield you from what is rightfully coming." And she felt a deep sense of empowerment as she realized that the cycle of disrespect had been broken, that her patience and resilience had been transformed into authority and justice. And the officers moved quietly, subtly reinforcing the legitimacy of her actions, as James Carter handed her the final set of documents, completing the legal acknowledgement of her control over her home and her life. And Margaret's mind was clear, her soul calm, as she stated, "I will now manage my property, my business, and my life according to my principles. And anyone who wishes to remain in it must respect that, or they are free to leave." And the words, simple yet powerful, settled over the room like a verdict, and as she walked toward the door to leave, her head held high, the weight of years of suppression lifted from her shoulders, and she stepped into the night air, cool and crisp, feeling the freedom of her independence in every breath, knowing that behind her, the Harper family and even her own son would never again underestimate her resolve or her strength. And in that moment, Margaret Collins finally experienced the deep, satisfying, and long-overdue victory that comes not from revenge alone, but from reclaiming one's dignity, self-respect, and life. And the sense of peace she felt was unparalleled, a mixture of liberation, triumph, and the quiet knowledge that her patience, endurance, and courage had finally been rewarded in a way that no one could deny or take away.